Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this GCSE Religious Studies revision video. I'm Wardle, and today we are looking at the key quotes you need to know for Theme D, religion, peace and conflict. So we'll be talking through every topic on Theme D, and we'll be looking at your key Christian and Islamic quotes that you can apply, in particular, of course, for those question 4 and question 5 answers. So I thought we could start today with a quick overview of the specification, which tells us everything we need to know for Theme D. So these are the topics that could come up on the exam. So we'll be starting with peace, justice, forgiveness and reconciliation. We need to know what those words mean, and we also need to know the significance of each of those concepts for Christians and Muslims today. We'll be looking at contrasting views on the use of violence, including violent protest. We'll be looking at terrorism. We'll be looking at war, including the reasons for war and the consequences of war. We'll also be looking at just war theory and also at holy war. We'll be looking at pacifism. We'll look at key pacifists such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali. And we'll also be looking at those contrasting beliefs within religion about pacifism. We'll look at religion and belief as a cause of war and violence in the contemporary world. We'll then look at contrasting beliefs on weapons of mass destruction. We'll also be looking at religion and peacemaking. So we'll be looking at what religions do in terms of individual religious people, but then also in terms of religious organizations, what they do to help those who are the victims of war, being peacemakers, for example, following in the footsteps of Jesus, who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So let's get started, shall we, with our first key term, which is peace. And this means the opposite of war. It means harmony between all in society. In terms of your key Christian quotes, our classic is Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers." That is a really brilliant quote to use, a really excellent, very short, concise quote that you can apply throughout Theme D. So really make sure you've got that on a post-it note on the wall, and you can apply that, I guarantee, somewhere in your Theme D exam this summer. You could also use St. Paul's quote, "Live at peace with everyone," again showing you the scriptural foundation, the scriptural reasons why peace is so important for Christians. In terms of your Islamic quotes, Surah 23 from the Quran says to say words of peace. And then Muhammad Ali, who is going to be our key case study of an Islamic pacifist, said that Islam is peace and not violence. So he said at the core of being a Muslim, at the core of Islam as a religion, is this commitment to peace. It is all about peace. Again, emphasizing why it's so important for Muslims. Okay, I want to use this opportunity now to talk about peacemaking. So remember, we need to know about how religions, how religious individuals and religious organizations and charities, how do they actually work for peace? So peacemaking as a thing, as a key word, means working to bring about peace and reconciliation. And that is another key term we'll take a look at in just a minute. In terms of why would a Christian work for peace, again, we can use that brilliant quote from Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount when he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." We can also use St. Paul's key quote, "to live at peace with everyone." That shows you what the goal of life should be, to live at peace with everyone. And so you should take part in efforts to make peace. Psalm 34 is another excellent quote. It says to seek peace and pursue it. So again, emphasizing why you need to be a peacemaker, because you are being told in Psalm 34 that you need to actively seek peace and work to achieve it in the world. One more quote from Christianity is from St. Teresa of Avila, and she said this: "Christ has no body but yours." Now, I've included this quote because it's telling Christians that you have a moral responsibility, you have a duty to put Jesus's teachings into action. Because in the world today, Christ has no body but yours. He works through you, if you like. And so as a follower of Christ, you have got to do the work he has commanded you to do, such as to be a peacemaker. So that's quite a nice quote. It's a little bit of a different style of quote, if you like, isn't it? Where it's saying Christ has no body but yours. Therefore, you need to be the one to put his teachings into action, to think, what would Jesus do in this situation? And therefore work for peace in the world. So showing you that your religion is a very practical thing. It's not just about praying in church. It's about actually making a positive contribution in the world. In terms of your Islamic quotes then, again, we could use Surah 23, which says, say words of peace. So you're saying words of peace in order to make peace and bring about peace. Surah 7 says God created you from a single soul. So that is emphasizing the oneness of humanity. And so you want everybody to be at peace and live peacefully because everybody is equal before God and everybody is ultimately part of one human family. All of us are created by God from a single soul. You could also talk there maybe about the sanctity of life as well. And then a nice quote from the Hadiths, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, is that God has appointed you his stewards. So this is something we talk about on theme B when we're talking about the environment, but we can also talk about it in terms of how you treat other people and, in this particular case, how you work for peace, because you could say that part of your duty of being a Khalifa, of being a good steward, is to make sure that the world is peaceful, to protect people, but then also to protect the environment, because of course wars and conflicts are also very damaging for the natural world as well, aren't they? So you can see that as part of that appointment, that you have that duty, that responsibility to be a peacemaker, to, you know, be a good steward, to protect all of creation, including people, but then also the planet as well. And then, as I said, you need to know about specific individuals and also organizations. I just want to mention here Christian Aid as a great Christian example of an organization who help the victims of war and also promote peace. And then Islamic Relief. Again, they are then your Islamic charity, your Islamic organization who work to help the victims of war and conflict, help them to rebuild their lives, and also work for world peace as well. In terms of two key examples, you could use Martin Luther King Jr., who was a key Christian pacifist, and he said we must use the weapon of love. And then you could also use Muhammad Ali as an example of an Islamic pacifist, someone who believed in the importance of peace, and he said Islam is peace and not violence. There are, of course, many other examples, but I think they are the most transferable in terms of, you know, we can use them for many different topics on theme D. And for me, one of the priorities with revision is really trying to be efficient and making sure we've got quotes and we've got examples that we could apply to a number of different topics, so we're not having to remember too much before the exam. And I think they are two great individuals to name drop in your exam should you get the opportunity. Okay, our next key topic then is justice. And this means bringing fairness back to a situation. I've got two really simple quotes for you on this one. So Isaiah in the Old Testament says to seek justice, whereas for your key Islamic quote, another really excellent one is Surah 4, which says stand up firmly for justice, even against yourselves or relatives. So that is emphasizing the importance of justice in Islam, that you must always stand up firmly for justice, even if that is against yourself. It's going to then get you into trouble, or your relatives, your family. So justice must always be prioritized. And of course, both religions teach that God is just, that God is a fair judge, and that again would demonstrate to you why justice is so important. Our next quote then is forgiveness, which means letting go of blame against a person for wrongs they have done. It means to move on. So your key quotes from Christianity. Jesus, obviously a very big advocate for forgiveness. He said to forgive not 7, but 77 times. Now, he's not saying there that you need to count them off and, you know, tick them off as you do, but he's illustrating here, if you like, the point that forgiveness is not something that should be a one-time thing. It should be something you are constantly doing. And so that quote there is a really nice example of how important forgiveness is. You should always be willing to forgive. You shouldn't put a limit on how many times you will forgive. And then I've got the words of the Our Father prayer as well. So that is taught by Jesus, and it is used by Christians on a very regular basis in their worship, in their prayer to this day. And one of the lines is this: forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So the idea is you are asking God to forgive you based on the fact that you are forgiving others. And so you could say Christians believe forgiveness is important because if they want to be forgiven by God, they need to be forgiving of other people. And then we've got quite a similar quote from the Hadiths for Islam. The Hadiths teach, forgive others and God will forgive you. So again, this relationship between God forgiving you and you forgiving others. Again, emphasizing the importance of forgiveness in religion, that if you want to be forgiven by God for your sins on the day of judgment, you've got to be forgiving others in your daily life. Okay, another quote for you then, or not another quote, another key word and some quotes to support it. So reconciliation, it means making up and rebuilding relationships between two groups or sides after a disagreement. Now, forgiveness and reconciliation, it's really important we know the difference. So with forgiveness, you are making an effort to move on. And so you're saying, I accept your apology, I forgive you, we're done. Whereas reconciliation is one step further. With reconciliation, you're actually rebuilding the relationship. So always try and think of it as reconciliation is one step further. You're not just letting go and moving on, you're actively seeking to rebuild that relationship, to rebuild bridges, if you like. So why is reconciliation important? Well, St. Paul writes in the New Testament that God reconciled himself to us through Christ. So again, this idea that because God has sought to bring about reconciliation, we should be doing the same. God is being prepared to reconcile with humanity. Remember, Christians believe that because of the fall, there is this split, there is this gap between heaven and earth because of original sin. And then it is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, whose life is sacrificed to make amends and in order to rebuild the relationship between humanity and God. So the idea is, if God is prepared to work for reconciliation with humanity, we should be prepared to work for reconciliation in our own lives. And I've also got there the example of the parable of the prodigal son, which is all about this idea of the son who goes off, spends all his inheritance, and then comes back to his father and says, I've made a mistake. And his father doesn't say, tough luck, you ran off with my money and spent it all. He says, come back, you're welcome home, let's have a celebration. He was lost and now is found. And so again, it's that idea of rebuilding that relationship between the father and son. And of course, that was taught by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. So again, another great example. And, you can absolutely refer to these parables in your answers, really make the most of any parables that any scripture that in terms of supporting your arguments with religious evidence. And then a great run from the Hadiths says that whoever makes reconciliation, his reward is from God. So the idea here is that if you make reconciliation with other people, you will be rewarded for that by God. And so, of course, that is an incentive, if you like, for Muslims to be working for reconciliation, because God will then recognize that and reward you for that after death. Okay, violence. This is a really important topic because it's a contrasting belief topic. And in order to demonstrate that contrast, I've got two images of Jesus. One of them is him giving the Sermon on the Mount when he says, blessed are the peacemakers, and he's looking very peaceful there in that image, isn't he? But then the second image is something that we call the cleansing of the temple, when it's fair to say he was not best pleased and he was prepared to use violence in order to clear people from the temple where they had turned it into what he called a den of robbers. So basically, people had started selling things in the temple that turned it into a commercial space, and Jesus was not happy and he used violence. He flipped over a table, for example, in order to drive people out and make it clear to them that he was not impressed. So, that really illustrates for us the contrasting beliefs that there are, in terms of the use of violence. So let's talk about Christianity. In terms of opposing violence, Jesus says to turn the other cheek. So even if someone uses violence against you, you should not use violence against them. You should turn the other cheek instead. And that emphasizes, doesn't it, the importance of non-violence. In terms of, again, another quote to oppose violence, he also says when one of his disciples draws a sword in order to defend Jesus from arrest, he says, put your sword back in its place. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. So it's saying there that if you use violence to try and hurt, kill, or cause damage, you are ultimately going to be hurt, killed, or damaged yourself, so to speak. So it's saying it is not a way to live. You should put your sword back in its place. Do not resort to violence. Another opposition from Christianity can obviously be the Ten Commandments, do not kill. As you can see from the definition there, it intends to hurt, kill, or cause damage. The Ten Commandments from God are saying, do not kill. So it's really clear and explicit there, isn't it? You know, you do not want to be killing people, so don't use violence because it carries the risk of doing just that. And then Martin Luther King Jr., who, as I've said, is our key pacifist, he says we must use the weapon of love. So the only weapon you should be using, weapon, so to speak, is love. So again, he's a key pacifist against violence. He used non-violent resistance in that protest for racial equality. In terms of your support, and remember, this is a contrasting beliefs topic, we have from Matthew 21, the cleansing of the temple, when Jesus overturned the tables in the temple in protest at what was going on, in protest at the fact that they had commercialized the sacred space. Jesus also says in Matthew in chapter 10, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. So again, this is suggesting, and you know, this really is a contrasting quote to a lot of the other things he says. This is suggesting that actually Jesus is prepared to use violence in order to achieve his aims. And so you could say that shows there are times when a Christian is justified in using violence. And then, of course, the Old Testament again, and again, Exodus, we have this idea of retribution, this idea of an eye for an eye, that if someone uses violence against you, you are absolutely entitled to use violence against them in self-defense, for example, or just in terms of revenge and retribution. So again, you've really got a nice mix of contrasting quotes there that you can choose from and use. In terms of Islamic quotes then, so in opposition to the use of violence, we've obviously got Muhammad Ali saying that Islam is peace and not violence. You could say in the exam that Islam is a religion of peace and therefore you should not be using violence. Surah 17 says, do not take life, which God has made sacred. So the idea of the sanctity of human life. And so, of course, violence carries with it that risk of killing somebody. The Quran is clear, you should not take life because God has made it sacred. People need to be looked after, not attacked. And then in terms of your contrasting beliefs, your supporting quote can come from Surah 2. We will use this quote many, many times in Theme D because it's our quote in terms of talking about just war in Islam as well, and indeed holy war. So Surah 2 says to fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not transgress. And transgress just means do not overstep the limits. So we can use that quote to say, Surah 2 says you can fight, so you can use violence if somebody is fighting against you. So you can use it, you are justified to use violence in self-defense or to defend the religion, for example. Okay, terrorism is our next topic. This is then the use of violence and threats to intimidate others. It's used for political purposes to build fear in the ordinary population and to secure demands from the government. Now, that's a really important point. It is used to build fear. You know, the word itself, terrorism, it is all about terror, it's about fear. So it's not just about the loss of life, but it's also about changes to people's way of life. You know, if you think about the 9/11 attacks, for example, the 7/7 bombings, it is about creating mass fear and mass panic, you know, on a global scale. So we need to know that both Christianity and Islam are completely opposed to terrorism. And so I'm going to give you a few of the quotes that you can use to show the examiner why that is. So, excuse me, if you've not realized already, I have lost my voice. It is the first day in 7 days I can actually speak, although I have now realized I can't actually speak, but we're going to soldier on, so do bear with me. So the 10 Commandments, in terms of opposing terrorism, we have from Exodus, do not kill. And as we know, terrorism is all about killing people. It's, you know, it's trying to kill as many people as possible, innocent people as well. So yeah, do not kill. It obviously violates that commandment. St. Paul, remember, this great quote is still transferable. He said to live at peace with everyone. Again, you're not living at peace with everyone if you are trying to kill them or cause fear, panic, and terror. And then from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is the official church teaching document, we read, terrorism threatens, wounds, and kills indiscriminately. So indiscriminate means it's not targeted killing. You know, it's just mass killing of anybody who's in the wrong place. It is gravely against justice and charity. So it goes against the idea of being just and fair, and it goes against charity and being compassionate and being a good person. So very clear condemnation. Again, in Islam, we have the same condemnation. So Surah 4 says, do not kill yourself or others. And you could link that in particular to suicide bombings. Remember, a lot of terrorist attacks are suicide bombings. The person detonating the explosive dies in the process. Well, Surah 4 is saying, don't kill yourself or others. With a terrorist attack, you're doing both of those things. Again, Muhammad Ali said Islam is peace and not violence, another excellent application of that quote. And Surah 7 says, whoever has killed a soul, it is though he has killed all mankind. So killing just one person is the equivalent of killing all people. That is how bad killing is in Islam, according to Surah 7. And then I just want to share with you this quote, excuse me, I can't speak, from the Muslim Council of Britain. They said this: there are over 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. The vast majority of Muslims condemn terrorism wholeheartedly, unequivocally. Since its inception in 1997, the Muslim Council of Britain has consistently condemned terrorism and looked for meaningful ways to challenge terrorism. So you could refer that to the Muslim Council of Britain and say, you know, they've got a more modern statement, because of course, with these quotes from scripture, these quotes are obviously from, you know, 1,400 years ago, over 2,000 years ago in the case of the Old Testament. So it's really important, you know, that we are also bringing in modern sources of authority. And the Muslim Council of Britain there have an excellent statement that they have given, that it is condemned. So, you know, a great piece there to show a more modern take on this issue. Okay, let's talk about war then, shall we? Which is armed conflict between two or more sides. Now, we've got a lot to talk about with war. And the first thing I want to do is actually just look at some causes, consequences, and religious efforts to help the victims. So, what are the causes of war? You could say, if you're asked this, and it could be a 2-mark question, or it could, you know, be any 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 question on the exam. So we want to know a few. You could say war is caused by greed, self-defense, retaliation, natural resources, fear, national pride, fighting against injustice and aggression, and it could also be caused by wanting to protect people. In the exam, you could possibly be asked if any of these could justify war. And so just start to think, what do you think? Does greed justify a war? Does national pride? Does fighting against injustice? Does protecting people? So just start to think about whether war could be justified. And of course, we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about just war theory. In terms of the consequences of war, this is what happens as a result of war: death, homelessness, poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, because people can't go to school, economic ruin, psychological trauma, poor healthcare, political instability, and orphans if children have lost their parents in the war, for example. In terms of what do religions do in order to help the victims, and remember, we're talking about Christian aid and Islamic relief here, they may donate to charities working to help victims. They may deliver urgent aid to the victims, helping those affected by volunteering to deliver aid, provide emergency support. They might raise awareness of the situation to get more help and more donations for victims. They may take in refugees. They may take in those in need if they're able to do so. And they may donate clothes or other items to help those affected. Why do they do this then? Well, I've got a couple of quotes for you. So in terms of Christianity, Jesus says, do to others what you would have them do to you. So the idea here is that, you know, religious believers help the victims of war because they'd hope if they were in that situation, someone would be able to help them, that somebody would show compassion and would help them. And then in terms of your Islamic quote, the hadith say, none of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. Do excuse me. And so what that quote is saying is, again, along the same lines, isn't it? It is saying, you know, you are not a true believer, you're not a true follower of the religion unless you genuinely wish for other people what you wish for yourself. So you would wish for peace, for help, for support if you were a victim of war, and so you should wish that for others, and that should motivate you to help the victims of war in whatever way that you can. Okay, so building upon this, just war theory. This is a really important theory we need to know. It is a set of rules for fighting a war in a way believed to be justified and acceptable to God. So the key word there is just. And if we have a just war, what that basically means is that it's seen as a justifiable war. The key thinker we're going to talk about is St. Thomas Aquinas. He was a 13th century theologian and philosopher. He's known as a doctor of the Catholic Church. And as I say, he is our key theologian when it comes to just war theory. And this continues to be used by the Catholic Church today, the world's largest church with over 1.2 billion followers. So he proposed, and as I say, this is still used today, this criteria for a just war. Now, you could be asked, again, you could be asked about this for any question on the exam. So really important you've got an idea of what the just war criteria is. And basically, this is the criteria used. It's like a checklist to determine whether a war would be just. And it's about whether the cause of the war is just and then whether the way it is fought is just as well. So can we justify going to war? And then can we justify how this war, how this conflict is being fought? So in terms of declaring the war, it needs to be declared by a legitimate authority. Some random person on the street can't just go, we're going to have a war. Let's start World War III. It's got to be declared by a legitimate authority, a government, for example. It's got to have a just cause. So when we were talking about the causes just a moment ago, when I said, do you think greed is a just cause? Do you think defending or protecting people is a just cause? The cause has got to be just. You've got to be able to justify it. It can't be for selfish greed, for example, or, over a really petty issue. It has to have the right intention, and the intention has got to be ultimately to bring about peace, to bring about goodness. It's got to be fought as a last resort. You can't just go, right, that's it, we're going to war. You've got to try every other peaceful method or means of resolving the issue before going to war. And there's got to be a reasonable chance of success. You cannot start the war if there is no chance whatsoever of any success or any end to it. You've got to be able to say, this is how we're going to get to the end of the war. This is the steps we'll take to victory. There is a chance of us succeeding here. And then in terms of how it should be fought, then we have got the fact that innocent civilians must not be targeted. So you cannot be doing indiscriminate bombings, for example, where you are targeting civilians, which is why weapons of mass destruction, which we'll look at later, would not necessarily meet just war theory, just war criteria, because innocent civilians would be targeted by them. And then the use of force must be proportionate. So again, we'll apply this to weapons of mass destruction, but it's the idea that the use of force has got to be proportionate. You can't be just using nuclear weapons here, there, and everywhere. Everything has got to be proportionate. In terms of your religious support then for just war theory, the Catechism of the Catholic Church supports it. So the Catechism, as I say, is the church teaching document from the Catholic Church. And the church says there are strict conditions, and really they're the only two words you need to know there. There are strict conditions outlined here in the criteria for a just war. There are strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. So basically, you need to really think about them before you declare the war. That's all that you need to know. And then in terms of Islam, Surah 2, as I said, this quote is brilliant and we can apply it for several topics. So Surah 2 says, fight in the way of God those who fight you. So again, a war is just if it's in self-defense. You are fighting in the way of God. So you could say, with God's support, God's blessing, if you like, those who fight you. So it is justified in self-defense. If it has, a just cause, and you could say the just cause is to protect yourself, protect your community, protect the religion. That leads us on very nicely to holy war. Okay, important we know that holy war is war that is believed to be sanctioned by God. So why would a Christian support holy war? Some do, some do not. In terms of support, we have got this quote from the Old Testament, from Numbers, which seems to support this. So we read, take vengeance on the Midianites even. I'm making up words now, I do apologize. The Midianites for the Israelites. So the idea that God is saying, take vengeance, do something about it. Yeah, act. If they've done this, you should take vengeance. However, in opposition, obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. is our key individual. He says we must use the weapon of love. And then the Quakers are a Christian denomination who are opposed to war. They are pacifists, so they say we utterly deny all outward wars. There is never a justification for war. They do not believe war would ever be sanctioned by God. As I say, they are a group of Christians. Quakerism began in the 17th century, in the 1600s. And Quakers utterly deny all outward wars, so they would not support war. In terms of a key example, the Crusades were an example of Christian holy war. So in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, Christians went on these so-called crusades to free the holy places in Palestine. These were considered to be holy wars as they were believed to be what God wanted at the time. And then in terms of your Islamic quotes, Surah 9 has a really interesting line. It says, when you encounter the polytheists, kill them. So this is talking about when Islam began, it was in pre-Islamic Arabia, in this culture where there was the worship of many gods. So polytheism is a belief in more than one god. And of course, as we know, what was significant about Islam and what also is significant about Christianity and Judaism is that they're monotheistic religions. And at the time they were developing as religions, this was not the norm. This was a unique thing. And so we could say there is holy war sanctioned, because it's saying when you encounter those who do not believe in the one God that we believe in, you can pill them, excuse me, you can kill them. That we have that justification, if you like, for the holy war taking place in the name of the religion. And indeed, the Prophet Muhammad himself, who is known as the key exemplar in Islam, he fought in holy wars. And he is described, as I say, by the Quran as an exemplary man. He is the seal of the prophets. He is the founder of the religion. He is the key role model. And so the fact that he fought in holy wars could suggest to Muslims that they should do so as well. However, Muhammad Ali, as we've said several times, showing you how transferable this quote is, he said, Islam is peace and not violence. So you cannot use war. It has to be about peace. And the only way to bring about that peace is by peaceful methods, or using peaceful methods. I just want to also mention to you the key concept of the lesser jihad, which is extremely important in Islam. It is the idea of fighting to defend the religion. So remember that quote from Surah 2, fight in the way of God, those who fight you. And this is known as the outer struggle. The greater jihad is the inner struggle for self-discipline. The lesser jihad is the outer struggle to defend the religion. So again, you could say a holy war is a war sanctioned by God in defense of the religion. Okay. And there's just a little arrow to show you the link and the connection there. Okay, we're going to talk about pacifism now. And we need to know contrasting beliefs on pacifism. Why would a religious person support pacifism or be a pacifist? Why would they not be? So pacifism is belief that all violence is wrong, which then affects all behaviours. So a pacifist, for example, would be a conscientious objector. So if they were told that they needed to go to war, if there was conscription, for example, during a world war, they would say, no, my beliefs mean that I refuse, I object to taking part in the fighting, in the war or the conflict, because I believe that all violence is wrong under all circumstances. So Quakers are our key Christian group or denomination who we use as an example of pacifists. So Christian pacifists are Quakers, basically. Well, no, actually, I've got that the wrong way around. Quakers are Christian pacifists. Do excuse me, I'm dosed up on Lemsip. So they utterly deny all outward wars, and you can use that line in your exam, and the examiner will know that is from the Quakers, from their official website, their official documents and literature. Martin Luther King Jr. is an individual pacifist. He said we must use the weapon of love. So again, that's an excellent quote to use, isn't it? You should never use violence. The only weapon you should use is love. St. Paul said to live at peace with everyone. So again, you can't be living at peace with them if you're fighting them. And Jesus, of course, said to turn the other cheek. So even if you are attacked, that is not a reason to use violence in response. Even when you are attacked, you should be turning the other cheek, because you believe that all violence is wrong. And as I say, that then affects your behaviours. However, we could say there is oh no, just one more supporting quote, apologies, jumping the gun there. Jesus said, put your sword back in its place. For those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So again, the idea that if you ever use violence, that is going to ultimately harm you. And so you should be a pacifist that will not only protect other people from harm, but it will ultimately protect you as well. However, Jesus also said, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. So that suggests that violence can be used if he's saying he's come to bring a sword. And then, of course, the Catechism says there are strict conditions when war is justifiable. That idea of just war theory, that there are actually times when violence can be used, it should be used. Another example, of course, is Jesus and the cleansing of the temple. In terms of your Islamic quotes, to support pacifism, we have got our Muslim pacifist, Muhammad Ali, who said Islam is peace and not violence. And he actually had his boxing license revoked for refusing to take part and fight in war. And then Surah 2 is our supporting quote for violence. So Surah 2 would go against pacifism because it suggests there are times when violence should be used when it is justified. Fight in the way of God, those who fight you. And again, we can link into that key concept from Islam, which is lesser jihad, fighting to defend Islam. Okay, one final topic, whilst I've still got some of my voice left, and it is weapons of mass destruction. And these are weapons which cause widespread, indiscriminate damage. And examples are nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. So, in terms of the background detail, before we go into our religious quotes, the United Nations say that nuclear weapons are the most dangerous weapons on Earth. So that really illustrates how harmful they can be. There are 9 nuclear powers in the world. 9. 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, however, are owned by just 2 countries, Russia and the United States of America. So Russia have almost 6,000, the United States have 5,400, and then China have 350, France 290, the UK have 225, and then the other one I've mentioned on there is North Korea, which of course is a very significant state in terms of its isolation from the rest of the world, and the fact that it is a nuclear power. And so, you know, regularly in the news for nuclear testing, because no one's got any idea what Kim Jong-un is actually up to with his nuclear weapons program. So, you know, there's a little positive thought for the day. In terms of another key term you need to know, actually, you need to know the key term nuclear deterrence, because this is what the UK's program, the Trident submarine program, is all about. It's all about deterrence. It's the idea of having nuclear weapons with the aim of deterring or preventing other states from using theirs. So the UK says we don't have nuclear weapons because we want to use them. We only have nuclear weapons because 8 other countries have them. And if they've got them, it's important we have them as a deterrence. Because if we didn't have the nuclear weapons and they did, they could do anything they wanted. We need to have them as a deterrence to stop other countries, other nuclear powers from using their weapons, which would ultimately lead to mutually assured destruction, which is the fact that if a nuclear war was fought, we would probably see the destruction of the entire world. And that is why Pope Benedict XVI, who has sadly just died, said in a nuclear war, there would be no victors, only victims. So should a nuclear war happen, there are high chances, or there is a high chance, there would ultimately be mutually assured destruction, that ultimately the world would be destroyed. And so just very quickly, the UK does, as we know, have nuclear weapons. The UK has something called the Trident nuclear submarine program, which is operated by the Royal Navy. It means there are 4 submarines with nuclear warheads, and one of them is always on patrol. Obviously, we don't know where it is. You can't go online and track it, but there is always one on patrol. Each one carries up to 8 missiles and 40 warheads. And so, as it says there, it has just been renewed by the House of Commons, and one of the Prime Minister's first acts is to write a letter that would authorise the use of those weapons. One of the first things that they do, they write a letter that could be handed to the head of the Navy in the event of them declaring a nuclear war, which authorises the use of those weapons. As I say, the chances are, if we had a nuclear war, we would all be destroyed. The entire planet would be destroyed. So there's our happy thought for today. In terms of your Christian views on nuclear weapons then, St. Paul said, submit to the governing authorities. So he wrote in his letters to the Romans, submit to the governing authorities. So this suggests that a Christian should support the decisions their government has made. And so if the government have decided that we need a nuclear weapons program, you should support them because you should submit to the governing authorities. And if they declared a nuclear war, you should support them because, again, St. Paul is saying submit to the governing authorities, respect the decisions that your parliament, that your governors have made. And as we've seen, they've made the decision to renew it. Again, the Catechism says there are strict conditions for a just war. So could nuclear weapons meet the criteria for declaring a war? You know, could that be justified? Is there a just cause, or could it be as a last resort? So you could say that they are justified as a last resort. In accordance with just war criteria, although I don't think they then meet the criteria for how a nuclear war would be fought, because they cannot be proportionate and they will kill innocent people. Exodus obviously says an eye for an eye. So you could say, well, you know, if another country used their weapons, we could then actually use ours as an act of retribution or revenge. We are entitled to fight back. So if another country used their weapons on the UK, we could use our weapons against them. However, as I say, that will lead to mutually assured destruction. So as soon as that button is pressed, you're pretty much pressing a button to begin the end of the world. In terms of your opposition, obviously, Exodus says do not kill, one of the 10 commandments. And as we know, these weapons are weapons of mass destruction. They are going to kill on an extraordinary scale. And then, of course, a link to stewardship because of the fact that these weapons don't just destroy human life, but they would destroy all life. Genesis 2, God placed man in the garden to take care of it. Are you taking care of the world if you're blowing it up and destroying all life on it? And then finally, of course, your Islamic quote. So to oppose the use of weapons of mass destruction, Surah 4 says, do not kill yourself or others. Again, it's going to lead to mutually assured destruction. If you use them, it's going to end up killing yourself. Everybody is going to be killed in a nuclear war, and all life will be killed in a nuclear war, which is why the Hadith say God has appointed you his stewards. And so, you know, are you being a good steward if you are destroying not just all human life, but all life, full stop? And then the final one, and I've put support with a question mark, because that first line does indeed suggest support. It says, fight in the way of God, those who fight you. But that second bit, that final little line is really significant. It says, do not transgress. Now we've got to ask, is the use of weapons of mass destruction overstepping the limits? Is it going too far? And that is sort of the question I want to leave you with today after watching today's video, because you've got to start to think, you know, in terms of your evaluation, in terms of the arguments you're going to make. Okay, fight in the way of God those who fight you. So yeah, we can use our weapons against those who are attacking us in order to defend ourselves, but do not transgress. Would weapons of this kind, nuclear weapons are the most dangerous weapons on earth, would these weapons with the possibility of mutually assured destruction be an example of overstepping the limits, of going too far? That is the thought I want to leave you with today. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope that's been helpful, and I do hope my voice hasn't annoyed you too much. It has certainly annoyed me. Have a great day. Good luck with your studies. Bye-bye.